Well, in the merry month of May, now from me home I started, left the girls and two, and nearly broken hearted, saluted father dear, kissed me darling mother, drank a pint of beer, me grief and tears to smothered enough to reap the corn and leaf, for I was born, God a stout McLeod, a banished ghost and goblins, a brand new pair of brogues to rot the love of the bogs and fighting all the dogs on the rocky road. It's a double of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to Herriton and down the rocky road, and all the ways to double of my
You're unmuted, Derek, so the floor is yours. You got as much time as you need. Take it off.
Cool. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everyone. And I know it's not AA, NA, or CA, but I belong in all of them. And I'm Irish. So I want to apologise, first of all. Ireland really is giving people alcoholism and Bono, and I want to apologise for Bono. And I want to apologise if I offend anyone during the talk. I'm nervous as hell. But, it's lovely to be here, and to tell them a story. And it's kind of like I can tell a bit more than I usually tell in the AA room. I was born here in Ireland in a small town in the west. Like this tiny little town, 6,000 people, and everyone knows everyone. And, I had a really good upbringing, from the outside. My parents, they worked hard. We had a bakery, we had a cafe, we had a restaurant. And all in one, and they worked hard all their lives. My dad never took a drink in his life. My mum, she only started drinking after I did, and I've only seen her drunk twice in my life. Our business goes back 100 years this year, and my great-granddad, he started this tiny little bakery, and they used to live above it, and there was no walls between the rooms. It was just curtains. And then they just built it up and built it up and built it up, and then my granddad, and then my dad. And my dad was working 70-hour weeks, just to provide for us. And we were well looked after, but everything was given to us with modesty. We were not flash kids. We got everything we wanted, everything we needed. But, but I felt different. I'm the youngest of two brothers. And even when I was a little kid, my two brothers would be fast asleep, snoring, and I'd be staring at the wall. And that was when I was really young. And I just felt so different. I was fairly good at school. I was fairly good at playing football, we'd say football, you'd say soccer. And, I loved that. And I was thinking the other day about how these, pop culture things affect me and how I carried it on. I was 11 years old and I watched Twin Peaks. And that was not bad parenting. That was just we had 2 televisions in the house. And I used to sneak in and have a look at it. And I knew it was kind of something special. And, when we were kids, my earliest memories, we used to take 2 weeks off, we'd pack up a tent, we'd drive to the port, and we'd go to France. And my dad would take out the map, and he'd be like, okay, south of France, or the Alps, or Switzerland, or Austria. And we'd pitch our tent, and I was the youngest, so I didn't have to pitch the tent. I'd be going into people's fucking caravans and sitting down and, hey, I'm Derek, who are ye? Probably couldn't do that now in this kind of environment, but, and my mom used to say, where the fuck is he? I'd just go off on my little football, and I'd be, hanging around with random people. And I remember one year we went to Lourdes because we're Irish Catholics, and we took a wrong turn at the Virgin Mary, and we ended up going into Spain. And it was the first time I went to Barcelona. I was 11 years old, and I just fell in love with the city. And I said, all the places I went to, and I'm a big, big Barcelona fan. I won't go into that because it'll take half an hour, but I've been up to 50 games. I ended up I'll fly over, I'll go to the game, I'll go back to the airport and I'll fall asleep, and then I'll go back home again. I did that 8 times one year. This is when I was an adult, by the way. But I just felt different. And at 15, I picked up a drink. And all my insecurity went away, all this shit that was going on in my head. The second time I drank, I blacked out, so I never had a social drink in my life. And I was a big book reader. I remember reading Leaving Las Vegas. It's my favorite book of all time. And maybe because of Laura Palmer in Twin Peaks, she was my first blonde crush. And then Nicolas Cage in the movie He's an alcoholic. He goes to Vegas. He wants to drink himself to death. And this blonde prostitute falls for him. And I thought, that's the most romantic story I ever heard in my life. And that kind of shaped my life, you know. Indirectly, I was drinking. And even at an early age, everyone was saying, like, you know, you got a problem with this. I remember I asked the girls my Debs, which is like your prom. And she says, I'll go with you, but you're not allowed to drink too much. And of course I drank too much. But I started working in bars. I picked up Stephen King books. I used to cut the cover off my English books in school and put them on my Stephen King books. And I used to sit in the classroom and I used to read them all day long. And I went to college for 1 year. And around 16, you know, I started self-harming. I started cutting myself. Usually like places where most people won't see, and I was like hiding that when I was playing football, and I was just a fucked up kid. And I went to college, I dropped out, and I was like, you know, Ireland's my problem. So I was like, what am I going to do? So I applied for a job in Holland. Now, being an alcoholic, moving to Holland is like the worst fucking idea ever. But I moved there at 19. No family, no friends around me, and I just, you know, I picked up another addiction. I started using ecstasy because I was into like the house music scene. I was working in a bar. I was living above it. I remember the boss came to me one day and he's like, Derek, there's a lot of drink going missing. I'm like, I'm going to get sacked. And he's like, I'm putting you in charge of stock taking. And I was like, hell yeah. But after a while then he's like, there's even more stock going missing. And I'm like, so he put in cameras. And I was like, what am I going to do now? So I went out the back door of the pub and I walked all the way around and went back in again. And I used to sit in the bar in the pitch dark, pouring myself beers and on my own. And there was a lot of that was blackout drinking. And, you know, I was lucky. I'm really lucky with my friends. I met some really cool people. One of my closest friends there is a girl, Anouk. And we share a birthday. Maybe that's why we get on so well, some random shit like that. But, you know, her dad was this famous footballer, and I used to go to his house, and I used to watch football with them, and they looked after me. And I met this other guy, Mark. He's a good friend of mine, still a really good friend of mine to today. And he was well respected, but I had this double life. You know, I was going out with them, and then I was heading across the border into Belgium, taking a load of drugs, ecstasy, cocaine. There was one nightclub we went to and it opened 10 o'clock Saturday night and it closed 10 o'clock Sunday morning. And we'd be the first in there, take a load of drugs. You know, I remember going up onto the balcony every night and there was a guy there and he must have been like 70 years old and I was 19. And he'd be sitting there with his beer. And all he did was sit there with his beer and drink it. And I thought, I've got another 51 years of this. And I thought, this will never get old. That guy was my hero. And he never danced and he never talked to people. And I'm like, that's what I want to do. And, you know, it got old quick. That nightclub was rough. I mean, yeah, I saw a guy launch a whole tray of glasses above the dance floor. There was fights. There was open drug taking, drug dealing. A guy got stabbed in the hall one night. Another guy tried to run over his girlfriend when we were leaving. All this thing. And I loved it, you know, and I'm not a fucking hard man. Like, I work in a sweet shop. I've got a cash. But I was like living in that kind of, loving that fucking hedonist shit. You know, I was like reading Lesson Zero and I was like, I don't really care because I didn't care about myself. But I found a new nightclub and I went with my friends and it used to take us like 45 minutes to get there and it used to take us like an hour and a half to get home because we never had a designated driver. And it was like driving home, fucking driving Miss Daisy on the way home, trying to stay on the road. And, you know, every girl I met, it was a one-night stand. I was an asshole. I'm not going to pretend to be anything else. It was, you know, meet a girl, go off with her, you know, that's it. But one day I was working in the bar and this girl came in and she was a friend of one of my colleagues. She was tall and she was blonde and she was beautiful. And I just took one look at her and I dropped a fucking glass and I ran. I was like that guy in South Park where he just fucking pukes in front of a girl. And I just ran and that never happened before. I hid from her. And then when she left, I like came out again. And then she came in a couple of nights later and I dropped a glass and I ran. And then she came in another night. And at the third night, I dropped the fucking glass and she looked at me and I ran. And then like a week later, I can't even remember it. I went out one night and I came in the next day and her friend said, "Oh, you finally talked to her." And I said, "What do you mean?" She says, "You were talking to that girl for an hour last night." I couldn't remember it. And she said, "Look, she's going to be in tomorrow. Ask her out." So she came in. I didn't drop the glass. I fucking ran. I filled it with vodka. And I came back and I said, "Look, I'm finished in about 10 minutes. Do you want to have a drink with me?" The first drink we had together, she said, "You drink fast." But we started dating. And her previous relationship to mine, the guy was physically abusive. And I was like, "Oh, I'm better than that. You know, I'd never do that to her or anything." And I didn't. But I didn't curse at her. I didn't bully her. You know, I didn't shout at her. I didn't hit at her. But fuck, I was not the ideal boyfriend. I was going out one night after work and I was coming home 2 days later and she was worried sick about me. And that is not a normal way to behave. And she wanted to have this normal relationship and I wasn't capable of it, you know. I remember one time she said to me, she said, she says, "You're an alcoholic." And I said, "How would you know?" And she says, my dad's an alcoholic. And she never mentioned her dad again. And the next day she picked me up and she brought me to a counselor. And I went in and I sat down and he was telling me this and she was taking notes. I wasn't interested. I just wanted to be left alone. When I was around her, I wanted to get rid of her. When she wasn't around, I wanted her being, I was never happy. And I remember one day I went out after work and she came home. I came home, I was after swimming in the river with a friend of hers. And I thought she'd find it hilarious. And she got up, she packed up, and she fucking left. And she came back at lunchtime, and she was originally from the Czech Republic. And she said, "I love you, but I'm leaving you. I'm going home to my mother." And about a week later, I remember I had to get a bus to see her. It's like 14 hours from Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, all the way across Germany. And the only thing they could show on the bus that everyone would understand because of all the different languages was Mr. Bean. So I'm actually justifying drinking in that stage because 14 hours of fucking Mr. Bean would drive anyone cracked. So I get there. I'm going there to apologize for my drinking by turning up drunk. Like, seriously. And I get there and her mother is there, her grandmother is there, a little Russian woman, her brother, her sister. And I said to her sister, I was like, "Where's your dad?" And she said, "I don't know. He's either dead or in prison. We don't really care." And that was a shot. That was a shot in the heart to me. And I remember we were walking around the village and she was like, "Oh, there's this really nice castle." And she was like, "When I get married, that'll be there." It wasn't when we get married. And I went back, and about a week later, so I'm going to do this right this time. And one of the guys said to me, he's like, "Derek, I got this book for you." And it was Cardinal of the Kremlin by Tom Clancy. And he says, "Why don't you read that on the bus?" So I was reading the book. Every time I read a page, I'm like, "I'm going to kill my friend. This book is crap. I'm going to kill him." But I got there. We kind of made up. I remember her grandmother, I thought she liked me. She gave me a bottle of absinthe and a 6-pack of beer. Like, I think really she was, trying to get rid of me. So I drank the bottle of absinthe on the way back, the 6-pack of beer. All I remember is walking up the stairs. And then the next day, everyone was waking me. And I was like, "Guys, I've had a long journey. Leave me alone." And they're like, "Derek, you don't know what happened last night." And I'm like, "What?" And they said, "You must have fell down the stairs. Like, you were found at the bottom of the stairs with blood coming from your head." And they called an ambulance for me. And I was like, "Seriously?" And they're like, "Yeah, and you were so fucking annoying. You wouldn't get on the bus or on the ambulance until you brought the greatest book ever with you. You were holding it above your head, and then you wanted to turn on the siren in the ambulance. And you were so annoying in the hospital that the other people were actually saying, 'Can we just let the Irish guy go first?'" And I remember trying to get out of bed, and I stood up, and my leg went. I was like, I just milled my knee. But I still didn't get the message then. But you know, I remember a month later she came back. Eventually we got back together. But you know, I was at the worst. You know, she had met me at the worst of my addiction. I was buying drugs off these guys. You order them by taxi. You ring the taxi, they pick you up. Taxi never brought you anywhere. They just brought you around the corner. They open the glove box and they'll sell you any drug you want. And I remember my boss used to come in every morning, read the newspaper and have a coffee. And I couldn't get through to these guys in the taxi service one day. And I got the newspaper before he came in, and on the front page it was like this massive drug bust, this taxi service, and I was like, oh shit. And they even printed the phone number of who I was ringing from my boss's phone in the kitchen. And I hid the paper from him. And he, you know, I remember like 2 days later, this guy came into the bar and he called me over and he says, you like your drugs? And I said, yeah. And he said, you can buy them around the corner here. And there was this tiny little bar. It was about 20 yards around the corner from where I worked. And you go in, you order a beer, you give the barman a nod, and you go into the toilet, and it was just your stereotypical drug dealer guy, the like snakeskin coat, the long greasy ponytail, this giant black guy behind him with the gun in his belt. And you know, I became a regular there. I was like leaving people in the bar, going over, buying my drugs, coming back. I even had like the city of Maastricht is fairly freaking big, and like everyone knew us. Like we used to drink so much in the nightclub that one of my friends headbutted the bouncer, and the owner went out and he told the bouncer to go to the hospital, and he brought my friend in and he gave him a beer and told him to calm down because we were just notorious for being assholes. And I loved that, you know, but eventually the girl came back, we got back together, and it was worse than before. I had no control over anything. I brought her home to my family and they all loved her. And I remember one night I was in the pub and, you know, suicide was always an option for me. You know, it was like a comfort blanket. I thought every time if things got really bad, that was my get out. You know, that was that, and it gave me comfort in some sort of sick way. And I remember one night when the guy said to me, he's like, Derek, your life is out of control, you know, you're going to kill yourself. And I said, yeah, that's the plan. And we, you know, we ended up coming home back to Ireland for New Year's Eve. And we went out, and the next thing I know, I'm waking up in an ambulance and she's covered in blood belonging to me, and up to the emergency department. And the next day I'm waking up in a hospital bed and my friends and my family are just looking at me, and I'm like lying in a bed and they're like, do you realize what you tried to do last night? And I said, yeah. And I said, it didn't fucking work, did it? You know, and I couldn't understand why my parents, my brothers, and all these people actually gave a shit. I remember one other night I went into the bathroom to get ready to go out, and I came out and I was just my whole stomach. I don't know what I did. I just cut my stomach to bits, backs of my legs. I was just, you know, I just couldn't handle anything. And I came out of the hospital and I went back to Holland. I was like about a week into the new year. And I went the whole way from my small town in Ireland into Belgium, got the train, and I was walking up the road and I was like, I didn't drink, I didn't use a drug, I'm not planning on doing it. Where I lived was on the right, and on the left was where I bought my drugs, and the switch went in my brain and I went straight in, and I can't remember much about that week. I don't even know, was it a week, was it 5 days, was it 10? I remember coming through at one stage in front of my friend Anouk, and I said, you know, I need money. And I begged her for money, and I got money off her and I bought drugs. And I went back to Ireland. That was like 2002. And I drank solid for 2.5 months. And I remember at one stage my mother begged me. She's like, Derek, can you please do something about your drinking? And I said, yeah, but after my birthday. And sometime a bit later, I took a load of tablets and I ended up getting sick. Like anything I tried didn't work. And my birthday was the 30th of March. It was Easter Saturday. Easter Sunday, I wake up and I think I'm going to have an Easter egg because we got a shop full of them. But it was my local my local doctor, and he said, "We got a letter here. You're going to a hospital." And April Fool's Day, I went to a hospital up in Dublin. I was practically poured into the car, and you know, I get to the hospital. I go in behind the gates, and it's across the road from the Guinness Brewery. Like seriously, whoever built a rehab across the road from the Guinness Brewery, fucking Alanis Morissette probably wrote a song about it. But I went in there, and I was put into pajamas, and I was sitting down eating beans and toast with a bunch of other mental patients, and they were saying, "What's wrong with you?" And I was like, "I'm depressed, I'm suicidal." But I'd never say I was an alcoholic. I'd never say I was an addict. I didn't know it at the time, and I did the unit, you know. And you know, the last part of it was to write out your first step. And the night before, I wrote it out, and it might as well somebody else's story. And I wrote the thing out, and I read it out in a group the next day in front of everyone. And all of a sudden, it was like this light bulb went off in my head, and I'm like, I'm an alcoholic, I'm an addict. Hundreds of people have been telling me that since I started drinking, but I admitted it, and I rang my family and I said, I'm sorry for hurting you. I know what's wrong with me and I'll do something about it. But I came out of that hospital and I didn't do anything about it. I didn't drink. I didn't use drugs. And all I did was slowly go insane. I'd walk past the pubs and I'll go in next week. And I was working with my family, with my brother. I went to college on a Thursday night studying literature. I got asked to work 2 nights in a bar, and I worked 2 years behind the bar at night, at the weekends. I just didn't have a minute to myself to even think. And in between all that, you know, some good things happened. I'm a big bookworm, and I went to a book event by one of my favorite authors, and I went to see him in Galway, and it was the first time I'd met an author, and he was so cool, and we got on really well. And anytime he comes down to Galway, he'd give me a shout, and he's a good friend of mine now. And I joined this. I went to this book event then later by Chuck Palahniuk from Fight Club. And when I was back in Holland, I had 3 DVDs. I had South Park the movie, I had American Psycho, and I had Fight Club. And I used to watch them all the time. I used to cut my drugs up on them, and I used to watch them all the time because I didn't buy anything other than drink and drugs. And I had my 3 DVDs. And I remember watching Fight Club, and I was like, just burn the whole world to the fucking ground, you know. And a few years later, when I was back in Ireland, I saw a poster for Chuck Palahniuk from Fight Club, and he was going to be in my city. And yeah, I went. I got the last ticket, and I was sitting outside, and this guy was there, and he was a nut. He was telling me how he was going to start a fight with the guy from Fight Club, and that he was going to get in the newspapers. And he said, you know, this Chuck, he's got this website, and it's called The Cult, and all these crazy people hang out in it. And it probably sounds slightly familiar to Dopey, but it was a website where all these people hang out, and he's like, it's pretty hardcore. And I went to see Chuck Palahniuk, and I went home that night, and I joined this geeky forum for Fight Club, and I met these wonderful people. And I just stuck around there, and I was posting stuff every day, little bits. People got to know me, and it became a huge part of my life. And you know, the wheels came off eventually with me. I started drinking again, and I don't know when it happened exactly. I don't even know, but it was around 6 years since I had a drink, and I went back drinking again. And I remember one day, I was in the shop with my dad, and I looked out, and the back door was open, which it's normally open, and something told me, just go out the back. And I walked out the back, and my mother was lying in the garden, in the yard, with blood coming from her head, and she had fallen. And we rang an ambulance. My parents are saints. Like, they've worked all their lives together. They live together. They go on holidays together, and the only time they're ever apart is when of them is in the hospital. And it really rocked the family. You know, my mum went up to ICU, and we all went up after. And I remember, like, the doctor had said to her, he said to us, you know, can you tell us your mother's medical history? And they were going through it. And my brother's wife said, she's got a stress-related illness. And I went, what are you on about? And she looked at me and she goes, you. And I said, fuck, you know. And the fright, it stopped me drinking. And she was a long time before she was back on her feet. And I remember, like, getting up in the morning and going on to the cult and logging on and being in a chat room with this girl from Australia and this cop from Chicago. And we used to hang out, and they held me together. And I remember my mum said to me when she came out of the hospital, she was like, she said, you're going on a proper holiday when I'm okay. So February 2008, I went to New York for the first time. And I put it up on the forum, anyone want to meet me for lunch? And I woke up the next day, and there was like 20 different people, and they were like, Frank flew in from Chicago, there's people flying in from San Francisco, and we said, fuck this, let's make this a great big meetup. And I got to America, and I often say I'm an unlucky charm when it comes to the Chicago teams. You know, anytime I go to see them play, they lose. But the last night I was in New York, the Giants won the Super Bowl. So if anyone's a New Yorker, no problem. €500 will get me there. But I started going to Chicago to Frank and his family, and they're all Mexicans. They're very much like the Irish. And I'm part of the family. Like, I had people in Holland that looked after me. I had people in Chicago. Like, they treat me like family. Like, for a guy that's not an orphan, I seem to get adopted a lot. And I kept going there. And except for about 9 years ago, I picked up a drink, and I was supposed to go to Chicago. 3 weeks later, I just couldn't stop. I changed my dollars into euros again. I blew it all in drink. I got thrown out of nightclubs. I got thrown out of the bars. And I remember going into my parents, and I just said to them, please, I'm begging you, get me help. And they said, you're staying with us tonight. And about 10 years earlier, we adopted a cat. Well, he adopted us, Cujo. And he was the biggest snob of a cat you'd ever meet. Like, seriously, he was like having a teenager in the house. It was like, feed me, don't touch me, and don't fucking embarrass me. But he came up to the room with me that night, and he stayed up right beside the pillow, and I said, I'm in trouble now. And I got up the next day, and I said to my parents, look, whatever I said last night, I'm okay. But my mum was up before me, and she had already rang the hospital. I ended up in the early house in Tune, in my town. Because of the Catholic Church, you can't serve alcohol till 12:30 because they want everyone to go to Mass. But I was knocking on the door of this early house at 8 o'clock, and the guy let me in, and I was drinking there, and I was like telling people like, oh, I'm off to rehab, and they were like, oh, you'll be fine, we drink more than you, and you don't need to do that. But my brother picked me up, and it's a 3-hour journey, and it was the longest journey in my life because all I wanted was a drink the whole way there. And every time we passed small town with the bar or a restaurant or a hotel, I was like, can we stop here? And he's like, no. We stopped in McDonald's, and I got a burger and a Diet Coke, and I got to the hospital, and I said to my brother, I'm going for a cigarette. And I ran down to the train station. I drank my last drink up to today. I just knocked back a pint of Carlsberg, and I was gone before the guy even turned around with my change. And I went back into that hospital then. And I remember like walking into the hospital and got into my pajamas, and I went out the back for a cigarette, and I'm sitting on this little wooden bench, and I just said to myself, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. You know, there's no more angles on this. I'm beaten. And I did the unit once again, and the same counsellor looked after me. And I said, I'm not going to meetings. I'm just going to do what I did before. But the day I was leaving the hospital and I was walking out with my suitcase, I saw this guy, and he was from my town, and I didn't know his name, but I remember seeing him in a bar 2 years earlier, and I remember looking at him and saying, that guy's got a problem. And I said, something told me I'm going to go up and say hello to him, and I did. And he said, what are you doing here? And I said, I just finished the unit. And he says, well, I did it a year ago. And he says, you know, I go to meetings and it works for me. And he says, why don't you come? And I did. I went to 1 a week, I went to 2 a week, I went to 3 a week. And I just started going, and I started to feel comfortable there, because my first couple of months I was sitting there going, I don't want to listen to these people, I don't belong here, I'll never fit in. And I just kept going, and I started to feel better and better. And, you know, it just turned out, these little coincidences, that my friend Frank had the same holidays the following year than the last year. And I went to Chicago, and I had my first birthday in Chicago. And he said, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to go to a meeting, I want to get my first tattoo, and I want to go to the strip club, because, you know, I like behaving by misbehaving. I don't want to be sitting on a couch with the cat all the time. So I got my first tattoo, and it was Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, and I'll apologize to no one for that. But and I remember, like, I came home and I thought, this is great. You know, this is my life now. Everything is easy. I'm in this, like, and I didn't realize I was in this honeymoon period. And when the honeymoon wore off, I don't know what happened. The in between the first year and the second year, I just, you know, I wasn't working on myself. I wasn't doing anything. I was just going to meetings. I was paying lip service. And my mental health deteriorated, and I got a phone call one day. My best friend was walking home with his girlfriend, and a guy hit him with the brick in the head. And he's basically in a nursing home for the last 7 or 8 years, and that affected me. And I just, you know, I got into like this bad depression, and I couldn't handle it. And you know, I always had that obsession with suicide, but I started to plot, and I started to plan, and I didn't want to do it that my parents would find me. I didn't want to go in a river, because I mightn't be found for a week. And I knew I needed help, and I just got up one morning, and I picked up the phone, I rang the hospital, and I said to them, you know, can you bring me back? Can you take me in? And they took me in that evening. And I spent 9 weeks in the hospital that time. And I came out, and, you know, I deteriorated again. I had to go back again. I spent 10 weeks the next time. I had my second birthday, you know, in the hospital, and thinking, you know, I'm a failure. But, you know, I had to do it. You know, I had to protect myself. And I didn't want to give up this fight. And I came out of there, and I ended up going back to Chicago, and I went to LA for the first time, and some magic happened. I don't believe everything happens for a reason, but I think certain things happen for a reason. And I was at a rock bottom in recovery, and I ended up in Hollywood for my third AA birthday. I got invited the night before to a meeting in the Hollywood Hills in a private house, and full of celebrities. Half of them I recognized, the other half were pissed off I didn't recognize them. You know, I'm sorry, but unless you've been in Twin Peaks or Mean Girls, I'm not going to recognize you. And it was arguably the worst meeting I ever went to in my life, because I'm not a celebrity. I don't have the same problems as them. You know, I may be an alcoholic, but, you know, I don't have them. And I just, it didn't click with me. And, you know, and the next day I went to a meeting in this like shitty little art house cafe. It was basically a cafe where they put paintings on the wall and called it an art house. And I left there, and my friend says, "What do you want to do?" And my primary addiction is blonde women. So what do? I go buy a dozen roses and I go to Marilyn Monroe's grave. And it was the Gentlemen Prefer Blondes tattoo. It was from 2 years ago to the day. And I'm sitting by her grave, and there's a marble bench, and I put the flowers on the grave, and I'm sitting there and I'm going, holy shit, like 3 years earlier, I'm in my pajamas, I'm sitting on a wooden bench in a mental hospital, and now I'm in Hollywood. And I text my friend, the author, and he came to visit me when I was in the hospital. And I said, thanks for your friendship, and I'm another year today. And I said, that guy kind of, he gave me a boost. When I felt like shit, he gave me a boost. He made me feel that I was worth something. And I always thank him every year when I'm sober, on the day. And he said to me, he's like, Derek, there's a famous bookshop. It's very expensive and it's very rare. It's on Hollywood, and just go in and have a look. So I go in there, and it's a father-son operation, and they have like all the pictures of the Hollywood stars on the wall. Michael Caine's quote was, "This is the museum where you get to keep the pieces." They're like Johnny Depp in their T-shirt on Rolling Stone magazine. And I walk in the door, and they're like, "Hey, nice to meet you." And I told them, who sent me and all that. And we're chatting away. And they had like first editions Dickens, first edition Hemingway, like worth a couple of 100,000. And I was like, guys, I work in a candy store. I don't own it. I don't own a chain of them. Relax. And they said, well, maybe we have something for you. So my favorite author is Stephen King. And they said, well, we got 2 first editions of Stephen King. They're old, but they're in good nick. And the first one was Christine, which I didn't like. And the second one was Cujo. So Mike starts laughing. He's like, come on, you named your cat Cujo. So the guy goes, and then Mike says to me, he's like, oh, it is your birthday. And the guy just looks at me and he's like, what age are you? And I said, oh, it's a different kind of birthday. It's a weird one. I'm kind of like 3 today. And he said, okay. He took a look at me and he says, come with me. And brought me into the office, and he said, I got all these first editions. I got all these books worth 100,000. He said, this is the most important one. And he opened up the drawer and he had a big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And he said, that's the most important book in my life. He says, I'm 21 years sober. And I said, I'm 3 today. And he gave me the book for a song. And I remember saying to him, like, all I wanted to do was to meet Stephen King, just thank him for the great books. And he said, it doesn't happen anymore. He's old, he's tired. He doesn't appear in public and all that. And a week later, I'm in Chicago. I get an email from the Stephen King website that he's going to be in Paris 2 months to the day I bought the book. First come, first served. So I'm not missing out on that. I go to work on the Monday morning. I leave work. I travel overnight to Paris. I get there. I go to the bookstore. And it's like a day early, and there's 2 guys sitting outside. And one of them was like, I'm number 1, he's number 2, you can be number 3. So I'm sitting outside a bookstore in Paris. And one was French, one was Italian, and then all these Italians arrived, and then these French people arrived, and a couple of English people, and we're all hanging out, and we're all talking. 8 o'clock that night, TV crew came along and wanted to interview the first people in the queue. I'm on French TV, like, holy shit, French national television. And I rang my mom, and I'm like, Mom, I was on TV. And she's like, what did you do? And I'm like, nothing. And we queued up the whole night. We were sneaking off, getting coffees. And, the next morning, there was like, I think in the end, there was like 3,500 people to see him. And he only got through like the first 800, but I was number 3. And I was up against a barrier, and along came another TV crew. I was on television again. I had gone quickly to my hotel, and my friend from Strasbourg sent me a message, and she's like, you're on French TV, I think. And I was like, yeah. And she's like, I was thinking it was you. You're wearing a fucking Lindsay Lohan T-shirt on television. I'm like, hey, it's my lucky T-shirt, So that was my finest moment, but I got to go in, I got to meet Stephen King. I walk in and the security say, have your book open, he signs it and you go. But I had a little trick and I went up in front of him and I flipped open the book and he goes, who's that? And I said, that's my cat Cujo. I just want to give you a photo of Cujo and thank you for all the books. And it was fucking amazing. Like I came out of there and I floated and I was like, holy shit, you know, if I didn't do this earlier on, if I didn't go through all that and work hard at this, none of this had happened. That was like my goal in life. I never thought it would happen. And it got me through. And I just put one foot in front of the other. And I just kept going. And then I went to the Twin Peaks Festival. And that was my other obsession. And I remember like when I was like 15 years old, I had a poster of Sherilyn Fenn. And it was like my adolescent version of a comfort blanket. I brought it everywhere with me. And I had such a crush on her. And I went to the Twin Peaks Festival and I walked into a room and there was 7 of the cast there and she was the last one. And I walked up to her and I said, Sherilyn, can you sign my poster? So that poster I lost in Holland, I got back again and this time it's signed. And I got to know one of the cast. And, you know, last year I turned 40. I had lunch with him for my birthday in Hollywood. But I really had unfinished business. You know, I was traveling here and everywhere. And I forgot to say it earlier, but just before I drank the last time, Mark's family, they were really good to me. And my favorite was his 80-year-old grandmother. And I used to go to the house for dinner. And she would always take food from her plate and put it onto mine. And Mark would go mad because he's like, I'm your grandson. Why are you doing this to the tourist? And there was like this little bit of rivalry between me and him. And his little 80-year-old grandmother would just cut off the meat and put it onto my plate, give me a thumbs up and smile at her grandson. And she's the only person I knew in my life that I have nothing negative to say about. And yeah, I was so fond of her. And 10 years ago, she passed away. And I just couldn't go to the funeral. I just couldn't go. Physically, I could, but mentally, I wasn't ready to go back to Holland. And I remember like her 80th birthday, and she came into the bar and looked completely out of place with her daughter, Ellie, who's Mark's mother. And I remember the two of them were sitting up at the bar drinking tea. And I ran next door to the sweet shop, and I got her a box of chocolates, and I got her a tiny little Milka cow, the little stuffed ones, purple and white ones. And it was the time of the mad cow disease. And I came in with the cow, and I was like, oh, man, this cow's got mad cow disease. It thinks it's a duck. And she was like, her phrase for me was always, Derek is geck, which means Derek is silly or Derek is stupid. And she used to always say that, even when I was acting like an ass. And I remember the Milka cow, and then what happened was every time I went somewhere and went back to Ireland, I'd get her a lamb, I'd get her a duck, I'd get her a pig, and that was my little mission. And when she passed away, I couldn't go to the funeral. And I felt bad, and it was eating up at me. And you know, just over a year ago, and I'd ring Mark and his family every Christmas, and they'd say to me, when are you coming over? And I'd say maybe next year. But they knew and I knew I just couldn't. I couldn't face Holland. I couldn't face all the stuff I'd done there. And then about just over a year ago, one of my friends from Maastricht, he tagged me on Facebook, and David Lynch from Twin Peaks was doing an exhibition in Maastricht in the museum that I had walked past 1,000 times. And I said, yeah, I'm going to go. And I flew over. I stayed with Mark and his family, and we used to always have Christmas dinner. And this is like the end of November, but we had Christmas dinner a month early, and we had crackers and we had presents. And it was Mark, his mother, his father, his sister, his new partner, and his little kid Jerome, and no Boma. And I always said to them, you know, if I ever went back to Maastricht, the first thing I do is I go to her grave. And the next morning, Valerie picked me up, and I went to her grave, and I just stood there and I said, you know, I'm sorry. You know, I'm sorry I'm sorry I missed your funeral. I'm sorry I didn't get to say goodbye to you. And I said, I'm really fucking sorry. I've never forgotten you, and I hope you haven't forgotten me. And we went from there to Mark's parents' house, and they had photos of Boma for me. And they said, Derek, do you remember the Milka cow? And I said, yeah, of course. And they said, well, since you left and up till the day she died, she had that cow on her bedside table. And it just fucking felt great. You know, I knew I was doing the right thing. And I caught up with friends. It was basically like a shit Cliff Richard comeback tour where I was just going around apologizing to people for my previous behavior. And I called to Misha's house. It's like I hadn't seen him in a week. And he's like, come on in. He's like, and we were sitting there and he's like, Derek, whatever you're doing, just keep doing it. And typical addict, like I hadn't gone in 16 years and I went back again 2 months later. I started to catch up with more and more friends, and I sat with my friend Anouk, and it was about 17 years to the day since I borrowed that money off her. And I was sitting across from her and I said, you know, I owe you money. And she's like, come on, it's a long time ago. And I gave her the money and she wouldn't take it. But she was doing something for charity, so I donated to that. And we were just sitting across from the table, and like I remember back then, I used to go to her house for dinner, and her parents used to look after me. And she moved to Ireland, and her mother, when we were at the going away party, she's like, Derek, just because she's gone to Ireland, you can still come for dinner. And he used to ring me up, and I'd like go out to the house. And I remember one night I was out in the house having dinner, and Anouk texted me, and she's like, do you miss me? And I was like, no, I'm still getting fed at your parents' house. And she says, well, I'm staying with your family tonight. And I'd forgotten it. She used to get the bus from Dublin to Galway to my town, and my uncle would pick her up at the bus stop, and he'd walk 100 yards with her and carry her suitcase and let her into my parents' house. And she was like, your mother always had the electric blanket on for me. And I'm like, I never had a fucking electric blanket. Like, did they just buy one for her? I'm like, seriously. But I had missed out on all that. And it was amazing. She was like, oh, you remember New Year's Eve, not the really bad one? And I was like, yeah. And I remember I'd been on a binge for 2 days before New Year's Eve in 99, and I had a nice new white shirt to put on. I put on the shirt and I got a nosebleed, and I had to be dressed by a friend. You know, I was 20 years old and I had to be dressed by a friend to go out and cleaned up like a little baby. And all that came back, you know, and it was real healing for me, you know, to see my friends. And she said to me then, she's like, oh, so you're saying sorry to people? And I said, yeah. And she's like, well, what about Hannah? And I said, no, I can't do that. And I'm like, maybe I'll send her a message on Facebook. And she was like, seriously? You know? And I was like, no, I can't do it. I can't do it. And she said, well, think about it. And for my 40th birthday, I was saying I went to LA. I came back, and my friend, the author, for my birthday, he named a character after me in his book. So I'm basically a policeman, which I'm not, in somewhere in northeast England, and there's a best-selling book, and there's a detective, Sergeant Derek Hines, and he's got a couple of smart lines, but I don't think we've anything else in common. But it was just such a fucking honor. I'm like, shit, you know? And there's like people in my town that didn't even know they were fans, and they're like, your name is in this book. And I was like, yeah. And it was amazing. And, you know, I had some more adventures in the year, you know, I don't want to go on, but it was like just last November, and I just said, look, I got to do this. And I took out my phone and I sent her a message. And I said, now she's married now and she's got kids, which makes it so much easier for me to apologize. And I sent her a message and I said, look, do you have time for a cup of coffee with me? One coffee. I want to meet your husband. I want to meet your kids, but I do owe you an apology. And she said, yeah. And I flew over. I went to Anouk's house the night before, and we were having dinner, and we were just sitting there talking, and I rang my parents, and I put a nuke on the phone to them, and my two parents are 70 years old, and they were like kids on the phone to her. They were like two teenagers. When are you going to come to visit? And I just started crying because I was like, I could have missed out on all this. You know, at 23 years old, I wanted to be dead. I could have missed out on all those memories. I could have been just that guy that died at 23 and, oh shit, he had potential. You know, I'm 41 years old now. I'm too old to fucking die with potential. So I just got to keep going. And I got up the next day and I went to Liège, which is just an absolute shithole of a town in Belgium, you know. At least places like Chernobyl have some sort of history for being shit, but Liège is just awful. And I got a taxi there and I went to an AA meeting and I got a taxi back and I was heading across the bridge to meet Hannah, and I started thinking of all the times that I made that girl cry, you know, that I messed her up, that, you know, and I, even if I didn't mean to, and I just brought up all that and I said, you know, this is 17 years in the making. And I went over and we had coffee with her husband and kids, and we're walking down the street later on and I said, okay, here's your apology. And I handed her the book and she's like, that's a book. And I said, yeah. But I said, wait until you read this bit. And she read the start of it. She's like, you're a policeman. And I said, yeah. And she says, I want a copy of this. And I said, hold on. I'd rang John and I told him, I said, I need to make a major apology. Can you sign something for me? And he signed on the front. He was like, dear Hannah, Derek is a character in this book. For how long remains to be seen. Happy to have helped you out. He's like, what does that mean? So I said, go to the end of the book. And I said, look, if you ever think I'm an asshole again, just read this. This is your revenge. I hope you enjoy it. And she reads the paragraph and she's like, you got shot. And I'm like, yeah. And she's like, you got shot twice. And I'm like, yeah. And she's like, this is fucking brilliant. And she's explaining it to her kids, and her daughter's a psycho. She's like making gun fucking things at me, you know. I'm like, seriously, kid. It was amazing, you know. It was like, that was my history, you know. And they always say it repeats itself, but I was going back. I was repeating my history, and I was doing it right this time. And like last year was amazing, you know. I got to know these guys in LA when I go out there. They're all ex-convicts. I prefer them to the celebrities because they're more honest. And I hang out with them and I go to meetings, and, you know, there's one of the meetings we go to and there's this like giant black transvestite woman that comes in, and she's got the skin-tight dress and all the lumps in the wrong places, and she always goes and sits down beside me. And she like crosses the legs like Basic Instinct with like two giant fucking tree trunks. And she's leaning up against me and she's like, oh, I'm going to be bigger than Whitney Houston. And I'm like, oh, seriously? So I love it though. You know, maybe in a way it's kind of cool. But I just meet up then with these guys and we go to meetings in all over the place. And one of the things we did, I got to chair a meeting in a youth detention center in Los Angeles for teenage addicts. And I was at the table with my friends, and we all spoke, and then they said, we got a guy here from Ireland. And the guy that was sitting beside me, I'd never met him before, and he was helping out. He was doing a chair as well. And he was sitting there, and he was, it's just one of those moments where he just looked at my tattoo and he says, where'd you get that done? And I said, Chicago. And I said to him, where'd you get your one done? And he goes, oh, San Quentin. And he had a fucking teardrop on his cheek. And I was like, then he started talking about how he wasted his life, how his kids don't want anything to do with them. He can't get a job. His ex-wife doesn't want anything to do with them. And I'm like, I'm sitting beside a killer and this guy is talking about emotions. This is powerful. This is what I'm about. I do prison service in Ireland. I go in once a month, talk to the prisoners. I got to go back to the hospital where I was a patient I got to tell my story to them. But this time I wasn't sitting in the cheap seats. I was sitting up at a table with my doctor on one side and my counsellor on the other. I've worked hard at this, and I love the life I have. And I had one last trip, and that was this year. Mark's dad wasn't in the best of health, and I didn't want the same regrets that I had with Boma. So 2 months ago, I flew to Maastricht, and I didn't tell them what I was doing, but I just wanted to see that man once more. And I went over, and I was making Lego with him and his grandson. And I thought, yeah, this is worth it. This is what it's about. I rang my friend Mark today, and I'm learning Dutch so I can speak to his little kid. And on the sly, he's learning English so he can speak to his Uncle Derek. And it's all those little moments. And then, I got to Dopey, some random thing on Twitter, and I saw a thing for Dopey, and I came along, and I love it. It's like my old cult. It's just a bunch of random people with one thing in common. We all come on here, we all hang out, we laugh. I hear people's backstories. I listen to Mike's backstory. I listen to Laura's backstory. And I'm like, how are half of us here and how are half of us still smiling? And that's, for me, that's human spirit. That's what it's about. I buried 3 friends from addiction already this year. And I know it's going to happen again to me or to someone else and all that, but while I'm here, I try to help people. I really think that Dopey is going to become a big part of my life. And, I found my tribe, and I'm grateful for that. And Mike said, when I'm finished, just say done. I'm done.